This is Conspirinormal.
Alright guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal. I am flying solo for this one, but I am very happy to be joined by Seth Breedlove and Heather Moser. And Seth, this is both your second time on the show.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Heather,
do we get a prize or something?
not that I'm aware of. I think you got to be. It's like the Saturday Night Live 5-timers club. You got to be on the show 5 times. So, but at least
something to aspire to.
You made the cut as a return guests, both of you. So you should feel privileged about that. Seth, I had you on back in, I think it was February, and we talked about your On the Trail of UFOs documentary series. And Heather, I had you on just about about a month and a half ago with Steve Stockton talking about the monster madness, which we kind of got off the topic. We got off the topic a little bit on that, but that was fine.
Yeah.
And we actually talked a little bit about the subject we're going to talk about tonight, which is the Bell Witch. And because, Seth, you have a film that you have done about the Bell Witch.
Yeah. We, I think, so I don't remember this timeline of events, but apparently I was talking to Heather about it back in 2017. So this has apparently been on our radar for a while.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we've been building up to this for quite some time. So I'm just excited to have it out there next week and start seeing how people respond to it.
Okay. Yeah, cool. It comes out next week. That'll actually be right before the show is going to post. So Seth, what interested you in making a film about the Bell Witch?
I mean, to be, perfectly honest, we chose this project, for mostly the reason that one of my oldest friends who's part of the crew is terrified of the Bell Witch, and I thought it'd be a funny way to mess with him, if we made a movie about the Bell Witch. And then, in the run up to the movie, I found myself getting more and more pulled into the story. And by the time we made the movie, and then even afterward, I think I've done more research and reading about the topic than I have a lot of the other subjects we've covered in the last couple of years. I think it just gained a personal sort of interest in the Bell family and life in the early 1800s. And and just looking into the area where the whole thing happened and the impact of the legend on the state and things like that. I really went from being, I guess, just having sort of a mild interest in it to really finding myself pulled in by the whole thing. And I'm really glad we made the movie. And to be honest, I think there's plenty of material left to cover more than what we got to, because I mean, if you've seen the movie, it's very centered around Ingram's side of the story, and then very much that 1817 to 1821 time period rather than anything that took place after that. So there's a lot of gold there still to mine, if we ever want to come back to the story, as I'm sure Heather can attest to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm curious, guys, about, because I grew up in Tennessee, and I've lived here pretty much most of my life. And so, I pretty much, grew up with this legend. I think the first time I heard about it was probably, 6th or 7th grade, actually. And especially when I moved to Nashville and that area, it was a pretty prevalent myth, pretty prevalent legend up there. And I'm curious, guys, being from another part of the country, being from Ohio, even though it's fairly close, had you guys, when was the first you guys that really heard about it?
Yeah, the first time that I heard about the Bell Witch was probably, 2016. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago that she came across my radar, although I'm starting to realize that apparently she was mentioned in things that I've been aware of for some time. It just hadn't been something that really grabbed my attention for whatever reason. I guess I just wasn't ready for the story or something. I don't know.
I got in. I mean, I guess I was made aware of it by Jason, the guy who's terrified of it, telling us about it. We were on a drive, and I can't remember what film we were doing, but we were driving somewhere, and he told us this story about how, as a kid, he had been made aware of the Bell Witch at school, and how he became so frightened of it that he was having like recurring nightmares, and eventually his dad told him that if they drew a picture of the Bell Witch and burned it, it would cure his fear of the Bell Witch. And that was sort of my introduction to the Bell Witch. But like Heather, I mean, it turns out I was aware of the Bell Witch. I didn't really realize who the Bell Witch was, or didn't connect that name to it.
Right.
And the interesting thing, there's a lot of overlap between the Bell Witch story and a lot of the other subjects we've covered in our films. In a way, the Bell Witch is kind of a classic monster story. Like, it's this, unstoppable force that moves into these people's lives and terrifies them. And it really speaks to a lot of what Smalltown Monsters, the series, is supposed to be about. In particular, like the way the legend impacted the community where it happened. Especially, they have that sign along the road, and they do the play every year, and there's the Bell Witch Cave and all these things. I mean, it's a huge legend that has impacted a very tiny community. So that immediately, I was attracted to that pretty much immediately. But the short story is, I think it was 2017 when I became aware of it, but I guess it's totally possible it was 2016.
Yeah. It's, for me, it's interesting. You said that your friend, saw it in school, and, or like I've heard about it in school. That's exactly where I heard about it too, was in school. So that must be like one of those things that they tell. Is he from Tennessee or from the area?
No, he's from Canton, Ohio, which is,
okay.
I grew up in Bolivar, Ohio, so he grew up in Canton. I mean, that story, that story is it's traveled, like it's very well traveled. And in the trailer, like we referred to it as the most infamous haunting in American history. Mm-hmm. And I know today, I don't think the popularity is maybe as prevalent as it was at one time, but at one time I would be hard pressed, especially in like the 60s and 70s, when you had country songs being written about it, and that kind of, it was appearing in Gold Key comics. I'd be hard pressed to find another haunting event that could even compare in terms of popularity to the Bell Witch.
Yeah, it has that real legend status to it. And I've been up to Adams, and I've never gone to the cave. I've never done that stuff. The whole time I lived there, I never actually went. But Adams, in and of itself, the one time that I actually went up there, just has a really strange feel to it. Did you guys find that when you went there?
I really enjoyed the town, actually. It kind of reminded me of home. Mm-hmm. I didn't get any strange vibes really from it. It just seemed like a second home.
Yeah, I'm in the same camp. And I think Heather and I both probably immediately connected the landscape to where we're from. Yeah. Because we're both from the same sort of part of Ohio. And, it's a lot of like farmland and some rolling hills and some really cool river gorges. And I mean, it really is not far off from what you find in like Northeast Ohio.
Yeah. And it's such a small town. And mm-hmm. Growing up in a small town, it just felt the same, really.
The only thing I can say about the creepiness of it, though, and this was mm-hmm. like kind of a slow build for me, because I was there for 5-6 days. We got there, and it was like, oh, this is just a quaint, nice little small town. By the time I left, I wouldn't say my opinion had changed drastically, but the one thing that I thought was very unusual was the fact that the Masons kind of dominate dominate that town to the point where we actually were like in the middle of an interview with one of the people in the movie and discovered that they were a Mason, and they ended up taking us to the Mason lodge and showing us the main temple or whatever, the main room. And showing us some of the history of the Masonic temple in the area. And I just thought it was very unusual. You go to Bellwood Cemetery where all the bells are buried and there's Mason symbols on most of the graves. And it's just a strange kind of, over time, it kind of snuck in. And we weren't looking for it. It just kind of found us. And I know even Tim Henson, who is featured prominently in the movie, told me he's kind of leery of the Masons. So I don't know. I'm not necessarily leery of the Masons, but I know that two members of my crew who are very into conspiracy theory were convinced we were all going to be murdered at any minute. So.
Oh man. See, that's the difference though. Where I grew up, there are a lot of Masons. There are Masons in my family. And so that when I see that imagery and stuff, it doesn't even register for me.
You know, like, and that's the thing, like I went into it and I was like the skeptic, but the one thing I will say about it is it is very unusual that the Bells, who are a sort of they would have been lower income than some of the other prominent families at that time in the area, that family has become the dominant family in Adams, that you can't, Bell High School, everything's Bell.
Right.
There's like a Bell Baptist church right down by the Bell Cave. So it's like and the only thing I can think of is the fact that they were so tied into the Masons. And maybe, the one thing that this guy said to me that I thought was interesting is he said, there's no one in this town. He was like, there's no one in this town who oh shoot, I'm butchering this. He basically said there is no one in Adams who is in a position of power who isn't a Mason.
Right.
And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I can believe it. I mean, Seraphiel sent me a picture of I guess from Google or whatever, from the maps, and it just shows like the Masonic Lodge is pretty close to the actual cave, as I understand it. So
it's funny though. It's back in a neighborhood. Like you drive back into this neighborhood, and then you wouldn't even necessarily know this is a Masonic temple. It sits back by, it looks like a house. It looks like someone's house.
Yeah. I mean, the Masons, but Masons are everywhere. And I mean, at the time in the 19th century, I mean, Masonry was a pretty huge thing. But
Andrew Jackson may have actually been I think he was a Mason. They think he may have actually been at the Port Royal Lodge, which at that time would have been the Adams Station Lodge. I mean, that would have been a neighboring lodge that he may have been at.
So we may have already recorded a Patreon segment for our listeners about the Bell Witch, but I know Heather is aware of this because we actually talked about this on the last show that we did with Steve. We got on this subject, that Joe Nickel, the kind of like arch skeptic, his method of debunking the Ingram account is that actually Ingram was putting a lot of Masonic allegory and imagery into his book.
Yeah, Nickel that's so stupid. Do you like the concept that there's this Masonic imagery buried in there is just idiotic to me. I don't see it. And I read that article and I still can't figure out what he's talking about. Like he's really grasping at straws.
It's for the initiated, Seth. You don't know because it's for the initiated.
Yeah, but is he a Mason though? Because I feel like he picks and chooses different parts just to try to make it fit.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what skeptics do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, at least he didn't try to say the Bell Witch was an owl, which is like his go-to.
Yeah, that's usually his go-to. His go-to theory, right?
And I like that guy for the most part, but that I read that article. It just seems moronic.
Right.
Well,
Too fine a point on it.
It's interesting whenever these skeptics come up with like owls being the cause of these. Mothman I think was explained in some ways by an owl, and also Sandhill Crane. But like Flatwoods as well. But like in light of like the stuff that Mike Clelland's material, I find that pretty interesting that they come up with owls as an explanation for it.
Yeah, right. I spoke with someone I know who's a Mason and brought up some of these points from Nichols' article. And aside from certain parts that he mentions that absolutely do have to do with Masons, the way it was explained to me without them revealing secrets or whatever is that say that as you're being initiated, there's a specific way that you have to walk around the room. And you have to walk to turn to the right, walk 5 steps, turn to the left. Essentially, the way they explained what Nichol did was to say, okay, well, somebody in this story walked 5 steps. That is a secret. Like, that's what they pulled. Whenever the 5 steps are relevant to the greater point of the initiation, he's just taking random parts that actually aren't all that important and kind of miss the whole point of what they mean, just to try to make it fit for his argument.
Right. It's an interesting article, and I would urge people to read it, but take it with a grain of salt. I find it interesting just that I think that he tries to debunk it using that, but I find it interesting that why would somebody put that kind of imagery in the book? I think that that's the interesting part, not necessarily that, because Nichol is just going to debunk all day. He's going to say that like poltergeist cases never happen, even though they actually do. But so
I mean, there's far easier ways of attempting to debunk the Bell Witch than going down the Mason, Masonic not parody, whatever. There's easier ways of doing that. Right. We have, the fact is, like, I don't think we'll ever know how much of that story is true and how much of it is fiction, or if any of it is true and any of it's fiction.
Right. I did want to talk to you, Seth, a little bit about like kind of like the production and the way that you did it, because I know this one, and I've heard you say this, that this one's a little bit more using reenactments than your previous work.
Yeah, I think the only one that competes with it is Momo, and Momo, Momo has about 40 minutes, I think, of screen time, with recreations. And I would actually, I actually think this one might have, if not in the same ballpark, maybe even more than Momo did. It's done in a completely different way. Momo is very tongue-in-cheek with the recreations, and we could always fall back on the fact that it was supposed to be sort of a fictional movie you were watching that was made in the 70s and was kind of cheesy and all this stuff. So we had written ourselves an out. With Bell Witch, we really had to go for it. Like, it had to be straight-faced, it had to be well acted and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know I don't know what led me to go this route with this particular project, other than the fact that, with a typical STM project, especially the movies, we can inevitably fall back on the witnesses and the witness stories to kind of carry the film, because it's, at the end of the day, it's their story. With Bell Witch, obviously, we don't have those witnesses with us. So at a certain point, it became very much, to me anyway, it became very much about making our audience feel like they were living in that time period. And so to do that, we had to, like I said, we had to go for it. We had to attempt to recreate an 1800s world. And one thing that's really been rewarding is seeing the reviews where they talk about the feeling, how watching the movie, you become aware of what life would have been like at that time, in that time period. Being alone on this farm, living in this house, miles from anyone, and suddenly there's, sounds in the walls and voices coming from who knows where, and then it becomes, a physical attack by this being or creature or spirit or whatever you want to call it. And so, yeah, I wanted more than anything to make the audience invest themselves in that idea and to feel like they were a part of that world. And so you don't necessarily end up with, concise, complete scenes. There are a couple of those where you're getting, entire sequences, but for the most part, what you're seeing are little like vignettes, and scenes that are supposed to just pull you into the world of the early 1800s. And so I think, part of that was to have Zach Palmisano, who always is director of photography on your movies, be director of photography of the documentary. And then for the recreation, Santino Vitale, who's our effects wizard and has been with us since Flatwoods, he was director of photography of the recreations. And then Zach was also shooting stuff that was involved in the recreations, but it's really like Santino's vision that's driving those recreations. And so I think we ended up with something that looks and feels in some way very, very different from other STM movies, while still feeling very much a part of the series. I hope, anyway.
Oh yeah, definitely. I felt like this one was pretty involved, and especially with the recreations, and pretty effective stuff too. I must say.
Yeah, the house. I mean, that house. That's one thing I have to point out is that we found to film this thing in was actually built potentially prior to 1830, but at least it was built around 1830. It's about 20 minutes from where I live. And it sits kind of on farmland that very much resembles the actual Bell farmland, at least to me. Big farmers' fields, and the house kind of sits back in a wooded glen. And it just very much felt like you were, as we started moving modern furniture out of the house and actually getting into shooting some of the scenes, you felt like you were living in that time period. It was really cool.
Yeah, I was about to ask you whether you actually filmed those scenes in Adams or you filmed them somewhere else.
Yeah, I know. It's Wayne County, Ohio, is where we filmed those scenes. But it is worth pointing out too. We filmed most of the interviews were filmed in the actual Bell cabin that sits near the Bell School.
Oh, okay. And so that was another thing I wanted to ask you too. Some of the people that you actually got to come and talk about the Bell Witch. Who were some of the people that you interviewed?
Heather can probably help me here because I'll more than likely forget someone, and Heather helped put this list together. But the big three are Brandon Barker, Timothy Henson, and Pat Fitzhugh, and those three sort of lead the audience through the story. And the movie is, in some ways, as much about them as it is about the Bells. It's not explicitly about them, but if you really look at the themes being explored, at least subtextually, I think those three guys are at the heart of that. Those, Brandon's a folklorist. Pat is an established author who's written a lot about the Bell Witch, and Tim has been covering the Bell Witch story for like 40 plus years and is largely responsible for the Bell, the Adams Museum that's in the Bell School. Wow. And then beyond them, we have a lot of different people that come and go throughout the story. Heather Moser and Forrest Burgess are sort of the other key storytellers, and then we have other people that kind of come and go. Dewey Edwards is in there. Bo Adams?
Yeah.
Heather?
Mm-hmm.
Bo Adams. Kara Tobit or Tobit. Yep, that's it. I nailed it. And Brenda Moss. And then one of the big gets for the movie was John Baker Jr., who's like this renowned historian. And in fact, like in the state of Tennessee, he's one of the most well-regarded historians in the state. When Brandon found out we had managed to get an interview with him, he was kind of shocked. So there's, I'm sure I'm forgetting someone. Heather, am I?
If you are, I have also forgotten them for the moment.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, it's made up. It's a movie that the interviews are made up of historians and locals, and for the most part, everyone in the movie is a local, with the exception of Heather Moser.
Yeah.
Well, Forrest, I guess too. Forrest is LA, so there's two outsiders in the mix.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Bell Witch. Let's talk about the story as you guys kind of like understand it. Kind of like the course of it. I mean, I'm pretty well versed in it. I'd like to think, but I'm not. You know, it's some of it. Even I tell you, there were things that I learned in watching your documentary that I had not heard before. So
I'll let Heather tell the story because I'm not a storyteller.
What?
I mean, I am. I'm not a.
you're a visual storyteller.
I'm a visual storyteller. At one time, I was otherwise, but those days are gone.
Yeah. So 1817, the Bell family started hearing sounds. Well, actually, the first thing that happened was John Bell was out on his property, and he saw this really odd-looking creature, which was, they describe it as like a dog with a rabbit's head, which is really odd.
Strange.
Yeah, super strange. And I think some of the boys saw some things as well that were off. Then there were sounds that started happening at night, scratches on the walls, gnawing on the bedposts, things like that. But when they would light a candle or lantern to see what was going on, the sounds would stop. The sounds start escalating, and then physical abuse starts happening, particularly to Betsy Bell, the daughter, and John Bell. Eventually, they start to hear whispers that become clearer at some point, and this spirit starts tormenting them, particularly John, and saying really nasty things to everybody except Lucy Bell, the wife of John Bell, because she adored Lucy for some reason. And she swore that she was going to kill John Bell. So things just keep escalating until John Bell starts having these physical fits, where I think in Ingram's book, it's described as like a stick sideways in his mouth. And he has difficulty eating, breathing, walking, things like that. And he ends up dead one morning after having a particularly bad fit a few days before that in 1820, December of 1820. December 20th is when he passed away. And when he died, next to his bed, there was a little vial of dark liquid that was half empty, and the spirit said that she was the one who did it, and then proceeded to laugh at his funeral. She also made sure that Betsy didn't get married to the man that she was in love with. But yeah, that's pretty much it in a super short nutshell.
That was great. I loved it.
Thanks, Seth.
What are you guys' thoughts on the Bell? Because you do depict this in the film, Seth. About them digging up into, like, I have heard two things. I've heard that it was a burial, like you depicted. I've also heard that they dug into an Indian mound.
Yeah. I mean, this is all I know about it. At least what I know about it from Tim is that there were mounds on that property, and in fact, we saw a mound back in the woods near the slave graves that you see toward the end of the movie. That's never brought up in the film because there was no easy way to do it. But at the very end of the movie, when you're seeing John Bell's grave, you'll notice these little like rock headstones. There's a point where Brandon is on the ground wiping something away from the front of one of them. Those are actually slave graves, and John was buried with his slaves, which apparently was kind of unusual. But back in that same forest, we actually found a mound back there. So there definitely were mounds on the property. And there's a story, and I can't remember exactly how it goes. Kara probably would be able to correct me on this, but there was a body found near the cave, near the Bell Witch Cave, like a skeleton that they believe was a native skeleton that was eventually transferred to the cave.
Yeah.
Where they kind of turned it into like a tourist attraction, basically. I've heard both versions of the story. It's kind of like the hanging woman, right? Like you've heard the version of the story that it was a woman hanging in a tree by a noose. You've heard that it was a little girl hanging in the tree, which is swinging in the tree, which is, I believe, how Ingram portrayed it. And then there's also that recurring theme of like a little girl swinging from like a swing, which is also what they portrayed in An American Haunting. So every version, every event that takes place in the Bell Witch legend has multiple variations. And I'll let Heather jump over to your answer, or to your question in a second. But I wanted to point out, it's one of the reasons we designed the witch to appear in the film the way she does. You see her in these two different manifestations. One is like as a veiled woman. That is supposed to be sort of a throwback to the version of the legend that includes John Bell marrying Kate Batts, or being betrothed to Kate Batts and then murdering her. That's a variation of the legend that exists and was written about in this famous Bell Witch song, which is hilarious and super campy. And then there's the second version of the witch, which is supposed to sort of call back to the possible Native American spirit roots, but it is pretty much directly lifted from a nightmare that Heather had. So yeah, I just wanted to point out there's a lot of callbacks to variations of the different events throughout the Bell legend that are sprinkled throughout the movie.
Yeah, there are mounds all over Adams. That was one thing that when I went down, a separate time from when Seth went down, and Tim Henson was taking me around as well, he would point out different areas where there would be mounds. And I mean, they're all over. And above the cave, there are burials that go back thousands of years. Kara's told me about those. And those bodies are buried in a fetal position and all facing, I think she said the east, which would make sense. But the body that's in the cave, well, there's not a body in the cave anymore, but they found that along the river at some point. I don't think the Kirbys did. I'm pretty sure it was there before them. But they found the body along the river and then relocated it to the cave. Then somebody stole it. So you just see the box, essentially, which is a stone type. There's a name for it that's escaping me right now. It's in the cave. But yeah.
That burial, that mode of burial is apparently very common. I don't know if it was common throughout North America with Native Americans, but I know that Tim told me they like basically fold the body in half, and I guess it was more down to just logistically they didn't have to dig as much. So they basically are, digging half a grave, and then the body gets folded and pressed down inside.
There were, when the Kirbys moved into the property where the cave is now, they found a bunch of bones that were in the shed, I guess. The former owner had found bones and then just kind of collected them all in the shed. I think the way Chris explained it was the family dog had just kept showing up with these bones. And she's like, where are you getting these things? And eventually they found them, and they had contacted local authorities and had some tests run, and they were told that they were Native American. And then essentially they said, I guess the authorities said, well, we're just going to throw them away you don't want them. And she ended up contacting the proper people so that they could get buried as they should. But
one thing that I was unable to find the answer to when I was there that I really wanted to get to the bottom of was Troy Taylor did a book about the Bell Witch, and in it he mentioned that mound would have actually been over top of where the cave is.
Yeah. Well, there are burials. That's where the ones in the fetal position are, above the cave. Okay, so Troy writes about it as if that is just definitively like the mound that is being referenced in the book. And I asked Tim about that, and Tim said there are mounds there, but they don't, there's no proof that he's aware of that would be the same mound. Yeah.
Well, but either way,
they're
that's
all
a weird
over.
Coincidence. Yeah.
Well, Troy, and I have that book here actually, and I saw Troy speak about that way back in like 2006 at a convention in Louisville, and he seems to think, and kind of like his theory is that when they dug this up, whether it was an Indian mound or whether it was just a burial in the ground, flat ground, that he seems to think that they actually unleashed something. And Heather just talked about the animal that was like the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. And it's interesting too that rabbits, Pat Fitzhugh has talked to me about this too, about the rabbits like have a significance in the Bell Witch story, which is odd and strange. But he seems to think that this was something that was buried in the mound, some kind of spiritual force, and that it was unleashed by the Bell children, which I find an interesting thought.
The other thing that Troy alludes to or explicitly says, I can't remember because it's been a few months since I read the book, but he talks about the fact that he believes that area is very much like a window area. And that was, I've said before, I see a ton of overlap between the Bell Witch story and some of the other like window area type stories we've covered, like Invasion on Chestnut Ridge or the Mothman at Point Pleasant. There's a lot of overlap. Maybe not as many what we would consider like classic quote unquote paranormal events, like UFOs and Bigfoot. That stuff doesn't really seem to happen there very often, but you've definitely got multiple phenomena. It's not just necessarily the Bell Witch.
Yeah, and I really did pick up on kind of that strange feeling whenever I went there, and it does seem like that possibly could be what it is. I know that there's been, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I know that there's been things that have happened after the main haunting that have been odd and really strange. Talk a little bit about the hanging woman, because that was an element that I did not know as much about.
I don't know why that particular piece of the story really stood out to me.
It's a creepy scene, by the way.
Yeah. And it's kind of like originally in the original cut of the movie, it was the first like quote unquote spooky scene. The chronology of the movie ended up changing over time, but originally that was the first one that you kind of encounter. Basically there was this event where the kids were out playing in the woods and they discovered like I said, there's variations to this story. They either found a woman hanging in a tree, or they found a young girl sort of playfully swinging in a tree. Mm-hmm. Those are the two variations. And what's interesting is Heather, in her interview, talked about how the weather changed and things like that. I had never actually heard that before. So Heather talking about that was the first time I had heard that particular piece of information. So Heather might have more to add to it, but I know that just in making the movie, that was also the first scene we shot with our lead actors. And I kind of consciously did that because I thought it was kind of a creepy way to start the movie off. and the way we shot it was also incredibly dangerous because we tied an actual noose around my poor wife's neck and we had her
Oh no.
hanging.
That was your wife?
Oh yeah. She was standing on a a step stool or whatever that we eventually removed in like digitally, but but nonetheless it was a great way to start off the shoot, was to put my wife in mortal peril while we film the scene.
That's true love, man. She really loves you, dude.
Yeah, she went for it.
Yeah, that particular story, like Seth said, has variations. And they explain it as the weather did change, got colder, things got a little bit spookier, I guess, would be an easy way to say it. But one thing that is the same, because of course there's variance to everything, but then there's always a thread of similarity between these.
Green.
The green dress.
Yeah.
The green dress was something that was the same in pale skin, and I think the long dark hair was the other similarity, regardless of whether it was the woman or the girl.
And if I can point this out, so if you go by the green dress little girl story, there is a little girl in a green dress that is seen in the Bell School still today. There's a really spooky story that Tim Henson told us about getting a phone call one night back around, this would have been around 2011. He got a phone call late one evening from apparently at one time there was an antique store in the Bell School, and he got a frantic phone call from the owners saying, we need you to get down here. And he said, why? And they said there's a little, they said there's the little girl's here and we see her all the time, but tonight is different, is how they put it. And Tim's like, well, what are you talking about? And they just begged him, I guess, to get down there. So Tim drives down to the school, pulls up. There's every door and window and light in the place is all the windows and doors are open and the lights are all on throughout the whole Bell School. And so Tim pulls in, goes inside. No one's there. Apparently they had left. I don't know if they left in a panic or what. He was a little murky on the details of that. But they had gone down to Bellwood, to the cemetery. So Tim comes out of the building looking for him. When he comes out of the building, he looked toward Bellwood, and what he ended up seeing were these lights, were the spook lights dancing across coming out of Bellwood down through the property that would be the former John Bell Sr., property toward the school. But apparently that little girl in the school has been seen by many different people. And they're, as you get with like all these, ghost haunting stories, there are variations as to who she is. There was a story that Dewey Edwards told us about a little girl who died in the nurse's office at the school. And he believes that's who the little girl in green is. But if you track back to the original Bell Witch legend, there's these stories about, this little girl in green swinging from a tree. And I think there's another event where they saw the same girl in green. Also, Heather, do you happen to know there's a story about the kids seeing an old woman in an orchard?
Yeah, that's part of the witch family stuff.
That's part of the witch family?
Yeah, that's part of the witch family. If it's the one that I'm thinking of, where
I don't think so. I'm thinking this is very early on. This is very early on in the story, where the kids see an old woman in the distance in an orchard, and they run to catch up to her, and when they do, she disappears.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that one then. Because it is.
I couldn't remember
for the witch family too.
Okay, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the witch family, because that is like some of the spookiest shit in the story, and it's some of the weirdest stuff too. So, what are the names of the witch family?
Yeah, Seth, what are the names?
You know what? It's my homegirl's typography, my boy Jerusalem, my girl mathematics.
Nope, that's boy. No, I'm just
crap.
I'm kidding. That's a girl. It's a girl.
Okay, my girl mathematics, and I can never remember the last one.
Black Dog, the one that
Black
is
Black Dog. Why?
aggressive.
That's the one.
Just think of the beginning of Led Zeppelin 4, and you
Yeah,
got
it sounds
you know?
like a Harley biker, and it just stands apart from the others as being really goofy. So I always forget about it.
That's the one that sounds goofy to you, is Black Dog?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Wow.
Well, I'm sitting here with two black dogs, and neither of them scare me. So
Well, it's the names. The names are very interesting because, like, I mean, mathematics in Jerusalem. I mean, that's weird, kind of straightforward. Typography is just nonsense. I've looked it up and tried to kind of figure out what it could mean if it was an actual science, but it's just a nonsense word.
it's a cool word, though.
It is a cool word, yeah. So how did these characters come in? How did they come into the story?
Yeah, Heather.
The researcher.
Yeah. So this is whenever things have really picked up and there are actual people stopping by the Bell home, because this was so widely known that people would just show up and spend the night in hopes that they would see things, or hear things rather, I guess. And so these four voices appear one night, and they said that not only would they talk and then eventually get to bickering and arguing to where Black Dog would have to get aggressive and shut everybody down, you could smell liquor sometimes as if they were drunk.
Mm.
And they would also just taunt people, I guess, and they could recite things. I think they were also really good at mimicking voices, but yeah, they just appeared one night, those voices, and I guess were a family. And then they were seen later by Betsy and Esther, I believe, her sister, at Esther's place. They saw a woman walking down the road, and then there were three children. Like, I think the woman went over into the orchard, and the children were bending the saplings and bouncing on them. And when Esther's husband came home, they were telling him, you know, get them off of there, get them to stop. And he couldn't see anything. He could see the trees bouncing, but he couldn't see any figures. And so he ended up shooting in that direction. He got his gun, and they pointed to like a knot on a log, and he shot. And then that night, whenever the voices came back to the Bell home, they were laughing about how Porter, which I'm not going to remember his name, but Esther's husband, had broken Jerusalem's arm. He was such a good shot.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I'm not sure, it's really difficult to tell how long those voices stick around, because that's the other thing with Ingram's book is, you know when it starts and you know when John Bell dies, but other than that, he's not really clear on a timeline. So,
Or if I can't remember if this was brought up or not, or if I asked you this question, but whether or not they interacted with one another, like if the Bell Witch interacted with the Witch family.
Oh, they, as far as I remember, I don't recall them discussing that she interacted with them. It was kind of like they took over the show for a while.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I had the impression that Black Dog and the Bell Witch were the same entity.
It does kind of sound like that just because of how aggressive she gets, but I don't think that's ever explicitly stated. Because we know that the witch answered to Kate whenever they eventually came to that. She answered to that, but I don't recall anything saying that she ever answered to Black Dog so much. But Jerusalem was a little boy. I do remember that. And typography and mathematics were girls, and then Black Dog was like the matriarch that had to corral everybody. But yeah, it does sound like it could be the witch as far as her demeanor goes.
And they would be seen like out in the fields, and
the only thing that was discussed of them being seen as a family, like physically manifesting, was for Betsy and Esther on Esther's property. As long as I'm getting the sister right, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, but they were there for a while. Like they hung around for at least a few weeks, or longer maybe. But they were super aggressive compared to. I think they were much more aggressive compared to like Kate. Kate, like I don't think there was ever like it was always pretty intense when they were around.
Yeah, And I mean, Kate would get aggressive. It depended on if somebody provoked her or not. As far as
But I think the difference is though, Kate. Yeah, you would have those moments, those downtimes where it was like Kate, they're just hanging out and she's singing to people,
right,
or
exactly.
telling the weather, being a goofball.
Right, exactly.
Why was she referred to as Kate? Why was she referred to as that name?
She said at some point when, of course, she went through this whole thing where she was messing with John and the family when they were trying to decide who she is or what she was. And at first she said that she was a spirit that was disturbed because the boys had taken that skull or whatever, and a tooth fell out and whatever. And then another time she said that she was a traveler who'd buried treasure and she wanted the treasure found. And then at some point she said she was Kate Batts's witch. And then the name Kate just stuck, I guess, because it was easier that way. They had a name finally, even though that doesn't really make all that much sense, I guess. But yeah, it just stuck.
Yeah, and they think that Kate Batts had absolutely nothing to do with it. Like, there wasn't... Like, I guess the story is that she was widowed or something, but they looked back at the records and found out her husband was actually alive when it was going on, and...
Kate Batts has been so tied to the story, partially because there are a couple variations of the legend that have really like overstated her involvement in the story to begin with, and one of them is that one that I mentioned where she was like engaged to John Bell. There's actually a variation of the story that engagement was in North Carolina, and then John Bell killed her. And then there's another variation where it's John and her in Adams and they're married and he leaves her for Lucy or something like that. There's these two variations of the story that are similar, but one of them is much more, well, he's murdering her and then she's haunting him. And that is, what's interesting about that is that we met a girl while we were in Adams, who we actually ended up shooting an interview with. She's not in the movie though, which I can explain in a second, but her name was Kay Ethel Dickerson. And she, it was total like coincidence that we interviewed her. She just happened to be visiting the Bell School. She's from Texas. That's where she lives now, but she had apparently visited Adams as a child and stayed with her aunt and uncle who claimed to own Kate Batts' old house. And so she recalled staying with them at this house and all these strange things happening, including a cat that she was convinced was Kate Batts. And she was aware of the version of the story she was aware of was that version of the story where Kate Batts and John Bell were engaged or married, and then he killed her and fled to Adams, which begs the question of how they were living in her house if she was dead in North Carolina. But that, it was interesting to me. That was like the version of the story she was aware of. And it was so over the top that like she had been told as a child that like a Kate Batts practiced witchcraft in the basement of the house, and like all these things that probably were just stories, nonsense stories that were kind of passed around. But it was eye-opening that version of the story has permeated so much of folklore that was the story that she had grown up aware of. And the reason she did not end up in the movie was just because we don't have much present day stuff in the film. Yeah. So I really want to do something with that interview because it's super interesting. Her uncle actually, who owned the house, they were told when they bought the house that every generation or every person that owned the house, that there was a man that owned the house, he died in 2 years, and her uncle apparently died in 2 years after they bought the house. So she's not, that interview's not in the movie, but I need to do something with it because it's super cool.
Now, Kate, though, she was actually related to Lucy, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have all of that in Tim's interview.
Right.
It's very convoluted. And apparently Kate loved Lucy. Kate Batts loved Lucy because she was family. She loved, the way Tim said it is, she loved Lucy, hated John.
Right.
Well, everybody loves Lucy. That's how it goes.
That's true.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of folklore in this story, because you do a good job of, one of the guys that you talk to is a folklore, I guess he's a professor. And you do a good job of like saying that there's elements of this story that are direct from folklore. And I guess really, for instance, something like Black Dog, just that name evokes the Black Dog folklore, right? So this is stuff that is just from the folklore of the area, essentially.
Yes. Yeah. The biggest example of that is actually, I could not find a way to get it into the movie. It was one of those things where informationally it's super interesting, but it was kind of dragging out the section where it was. But Brandon goes into this whole thing when it is talking about, Heather, help me out here. The name of the slave that split the dog's head. Aberdeen Bell, or Aberdeen. Aberdeen, that story has to be at least in some way derived from folklore, because apparently there are all these stories, these folkloric stories throughout Tennessee of someone's dog being injured or hurt or cut in two and then put back together. And apparently he references this one. There's this really famous one where like a guy is swinging an axe or something and accidentally cuts his dog in two, and then he sews it back together. And when it's sewed back together, he accidentally sews the sides wrong. And so like its head is at one end or something. It's really weird. But apparently this is like really common in Tennessee folklore. And this is a couple centuries old. Like this goes way back. And he gives some references that were really interesting. And you have to believe that Aberdeen story might in some way be pulling from that folkloric past. Heather understands this stuff on a level that I don't. Pretty much anyone who actually has a college degree understands these things better than I do and can speak much more eloquently about them. I'm just kind of pulling from what I've heard, from the people that we interviewed or talked to. So I don't have the like scholarly context that they do, like Brandon does or Heather will have. But I thought there was a really interesting connection between, their folklore and that story.
What's your thoughts on all that, Heather?
Yeah, there are tons of elements in there that draw upon folklore. And I think it's another way it's interesting, the elements that draw upon many different things. Like we have a difficult time categorizing what the Bell Witch was. And I think part of that is because some of the elements of folklore that are within the story are all over the place. We have elements of witches when it comes to the idea of that witch hunter that shows up with Andrew Jackson, and he brags that he has a silver bullet that can kill a witch. That's part of folklore, especially in the Appalachian Mountain region, that silver can kill a witch. And then, like you said, Black Dog, but of course also you have familiars with witches that are usually black. There are hares, rabbits, things like that. There are stories of spook lights. That's all over the place, not just this particular region. But it pulls elements from all over the place that are in many different stories. And I would think the first thing that I think of course, I'm not familiar with the Tennessee story that Brandon was talking about, although now I want to know about it. The idea of multiple heads on a dog as a classicist reminds me of Cerberus, the dog of the underworld, but he had 3 heads, but still the idea of something dead, or undead rather, having multiple heads, that still evokes imagery of the underworld, death, darker sides, things like that. So it's all over the place, but it's just full of folklore. More folklore than Masonic imagery, I would say.
Yeah. Would you think something like that with the dogs, that is probably that is a reference to Cerberus, and that is like a memory of that mythology, in a way?
I'm sure that Cerberus is probably not the only creature like that, but
Multi-headed
it's
dog.
possible. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I guess you'd have to look into the people that were in that region, and then what their native or ancestral mythologies would hold, because I think that that's kind of where you get the key to a lot of these places. And that's something that we kind of talked about in Mothman Legacy, as far as the people of the area kind of influences the folklore as far as their ancestors go.
Right. That's a very good point, and you're bringing in also too. I mean, especially I guess with the slaves, you're bringing in that African folklore as well. So it seems to be all over the place and really influences the story. Let's talk a little bit about like the events like after the haunting, things that happened after that maybe have like struck you guys, and what because I know that the witch says that she will return, and I think that's sometime in like the 1930s, if I'm correct. And I know that the book that I actually have here, that I think it's Charles Bell, he actually writes the book I've read about like 1932. So, what are some of like the subsequent events?
All I've got is that 7 years. You know, Kate, before she disappeared or whatever, before she went away, said she'd be back in 7 years. Is that right, Heather?
Yep.
7.
Yep.
7 years. And then she did come back, but only really appeared to. Is it John Jr.? John Jr. Yeah, and she hung out with him for a little while, and they chatted, and that stuff's really weird. It gets into like apocalypse predicting and all sorts of like prophecy stuff. It's very odd, and kind of like doesn't jive with anything that's come before it. So I don't quite know what to make of that part of the story. And then that's it. Like she had promised she'd be back in 109 years.
I think it was 107.
107 years. But as far as I know, that never happened. So Heather probably has more information.
A lot of sevens in there. That's interesting.
Yeah. So she did come back and she talked to John Jr. And like Seth said, it was a lot of predicting of things that would come, end of times type stuff. Like Nostradamus is sort of what it reminds me of. And then 107. But I think that's in Charles Bailey Bell's book, that is even as much as he knows, she hadn't come back yet. And as far as I know, she hasn't officially come back since then. But after she leaves, Betsy marries her teacher, Richard Powell, who is I think a very established lawmaker by that point, a statesman. And they live in Tennessee until he dies, and then she moves down to Mississippi, which is where and that's where she's buried today. And that's where you get the Mississippi version of the legend. And so I think there's an interesting story that Pat Fitzhugh mentions, that it was I can't remember how many grands after John Bell it was, if it was a great grandchild or what. There's a story that's very similar to something at the beginning of the legend where one of the granddaughters falls in love with someone, a farm overseer or something, and her father kills the guy out of anger, and because he doesn't want them to be together. And then she falls very ill when she realizes that her beloved is dead, and then she dies as a result of heartbreak, I guess. And as they're taking her casket to the cemetery, there's this massive bird that flies over the casket, the entire procession to the burial, and I think it had a bell on it or something, and it was a large dark bird, I believe. But it's reminiscent of a story, one of the variations, where back in North Carolina, before John Bell and Lucy moved to Tennessee, there was a story that John Bell killed a farm overseer because the farm overseer was in love with his daughter or something, which again doesn't make any sense because there wasn't a daughter that was old enough at the time. She was like 3, I think, was the oldest child at that point. So it doesn't really, the stories don't really make sense. But I don't know. It's to see it come full circle, I guess, at least in different traditions, is interesting.
How much of you guys do you think of the story is tradition, and how much do you think is actually truth?
Well, I mean, you know that the Bell family existed. So we know that that's true.
Yeah.
I
Nailed it.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the rest goes, I have no idea. I don't know why Ingram would have created such an elaborate story in the way that he did if there wasn't something that happened. But then the other side of that argument is that despite some of the big names and the big stories that they talk about, there's no evidence that we've found so far in the historical record to verify it. So I don't know. I think something did happen though, because when I was looking into stuff for Seth for this, I did find a newspaper article that predates Ingram's writings. It talks about the Bell Witch, and it's a story about Springfield's ghost. And it talks about a spirit that was active in I think it was a doctor's home in Springfield. And a similar thing, people showed up to try to hear the sounds or see something move or whatnot. And in that, they mention that so many years prior, there was something known as the Bell Witch. But that is before Ingram started pumping out this book. So either he was really in the works for decades prior to its publication, or there was something that happened. I just don't know how much.
Yeah, that article she found super interesting too. What year was that, Heather?
I feel like that was 1860s, 1870s.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it really predates the Ingram stuff by like a long time, if I remember right from talking to you about it.
Yeah. It's 1880. April
Okay.
27th and April 26th, or April 27th and 28th, 1880 is when the article came out.
Yeah, I think Ingram wrote it in 1894. I think was when he wrote his book.
Where I'm at on it, if anyone cares, which I wouldn't if I was listening to this.
Of course.
I care.
No, I mean, if I was, I mean, I'm kind of with Heather. Like, this is a super convoluted story to concoct, and maybe that was part of the plan, was to make it so insane that, people would assume that it was real. Because, one thing Pat Fitzhugh said to me during the making of it was, you have to be real careful, because the tricky part of turning this into a film is making sure it isn't just a series of unconnected events. And because really the book comes down to just scene after, little scenes. One thing happens and then another thing happens and then another thing happens, and they're kind of like unconnected. Yeah. And if you're a storyteller, that's a lousy way to tell a story. Like if you're inventing a story, that's not an easy way to create a believable or a structured story. It just flies in the face of that. So I don't. The other thing about it, and I think I just said this to Heather on her show like last week, but the witch is, the personality is so specific. Like she is who she is. And if she is a fictional character, if the spirit is a fictional character, it is one of the greatest fictional characters ever invented, ever created. Like she's got such a defined personality and such a specific personality, and she acts in ways and behaves in ways that seem real. Like she lives and breathes on that page. And I think that in itself adds an air of truth to the whole thing. I mean, even if she is a fictional character, she's been brought to life on the page. So I don't know where I stand on the whole thing. I think large portions of this are probably fiction. And at the same time, I do think there is truth to it. I just don't know what that is. And I would think that pretty much everyone involved in the story and in investigating and researching the story, from Tim to Pat, Brandon, Dewey, all these guys, I think they would all basically say that same thing. They have no idea. They have no idea of what is true and what isn't. But that doesn't make it any less important to remember, and it certainly doesn't make it any less exciting to look into.
Right, because it's a great story no matter what. I think it's an incredibly fascinating story. So a little bit before I watched your documentary that you sent me, Seth, Josh Gates has this new show that's kind of like a spin-off of his show I guess he's on the Travel Channel. I can't even keep up with all the channels, but which one it is. So he sends his little investigators to Adams, and I'm going to tell you, your documentary was so much better than this show. I would just kudos to you. But they actually pulled in this guy that found it was a travel log from someone that was on a military expedition. Around the same time period, and they're actually like 2 or 3 sentences about that they were in this area and that they heard stories of this girl that was being tormented by a spirit. And it's pretty contemporary. It seems like it was pretty contemporary. That guy, I think he lives in Nashville. I can't remember what his name was, but I thought that was pretty fascinating. And that's essentially like the core of the story, is that this Poltergeist case happened. And if you really look at, and you do a good job of showing kind of the escalation of the case, right? It starts off with the knocking. It starts to kind of form a voice, and then it starts to talk. And that's totally in line with other Poltergeist cases. And 2 that I can think of off the top of my head is the Enfield case, where you have the same kind of thing. And of course the little girl speaks in that weird voice, which no one can convince me that there wasn't something supernatural going on there. If you've heard those recordings, there's no way that's coming out of a little girl. But anyway, but it was. But anyway, the one that really is similar to me, to the Bell Witch, is Jeff the Talking Mongoose.
Yeah. That's the one that everyone references, and there are very big, very large similarities between the 2 stories. The Bell Witch almost loses out because there's a mongoose involved, though. Like mongoose versus spirit, mongoose is always going to win.
Well, it was the same thing, right? It was the rapping. It started to form this voice. It started to talk to everybody, say that it was
and then it tells them Jeff the Talking Mongoose.
Yes.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
Like if you put, we should make a sequel to the Bell Witch that's just called Jeff, the Mark of the Jeff the Talking Mongoose. Like I would do that movie. But yeah, they're super similar to each other, and the Talking Mongoose thing. The strange thing about that is I don't know that case is like 1940
1930s. It's in the
1930s.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and there are huge similarities down to specific events that sort of connect to each other. And I think it was the Astonishing Legends guys that first pointed that out to me, was the connection between Jeff the Talking Mongoose and Kate the Bell Witch.
but also too, you have in all 3 cases, the Bell Witch case, which I think is based on a core of truth, and Jeff and Enfield, you have these girls that are roughly the same age. So it's kind of like, that is the biggest one of the biggest things about Poltergeist is that it can be boys, but most often it's girls around the ages of around probably 10 to 14, as I kind of understand it.
Yeah, that reminds me as well as of the witch trials. You know, it was the younger girls that would actually start off these crazes, saying that, you know, acting as if they were possessed or something like that. It's all around that same pre-adolescence, adolescenthood there.
Yes.
I have nothing else to add to that. I'm sorry. I'm still hung up on the mongoose.
Well, who couldn't be hung up on the mongoose? I mean, any time that you bring mongoose into it. Kind of like the ongoing curse of the Bell Witch, essentially. This, you do talk about a couple of cases where people have stolen rocks from the Bell Witch Cave, which I've never kind of quite understood the association between the Bell Witch and the Bell Witch Cave, but the stealing rocks, items, those type of things. I think there was, like, in the 1950s, there was people that went up to Adams, teenagers, they got involved in a car accident and died. You know, all this kind of stuff also happens with this case.
Yeah, I mean, that history, or that present day, not present day, but I don't even know, it's like a mythology that's grown up around it. And I understand that those people claim those things happened, although I will say Aaron brought home a very large piece of flint that he found near the Bell cabin, and has not yet died, although, you know, it wouldn't surprise me. He's very reckless, Aaron, that works on the crew and also plays John Jr. in the movie. He's managed to survive, but yeah, there's all sorts of stories about people
So far.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Still got a month left in this year. But yeah, there's the stories. So the one that is in the movie is the reference where they talk about the kids that came in from Nashville and took John and Lucy's headstone, and then they were in a car wreck. I don't know if it was like driving back to Nashville or later, you know, driving back to Nashville, they get in a car wreck and two of the kids die. There's other stories like that. Some of my favorites involve two incidents where people tried to knock down the monolith not monolith. What am I talking about?
You're thinking about all those monoliths.
I am.
Springing up all over the place.
What do they call the thing that's in the middle?
Obelisk.
The obelisk. Yeah, sorry. There's apparently been two incidences where people attempted to knock down the obelisk that sits in the middle of Bellwood Cemetery, and they actually constructed this concrete wall around the headstones and the obelisk because of the first time it had happened.
It was a truck,
and apparently
right?
the second time it was a truck. I think the second dude literally made it back there and tried to mount the wall in his truck, and it ended up, you know, hitting it and got arrested and went to jail. But I find that really bizarre, that people are trying to knock down the Bell obelisk. And apparently the first guy was successful, because that obelisk at one point in time was much bigger. They told me that you could see the obelisk from very far away. Today it's smaller, and apparently that's because the first guy actually managed to connect his car with the obelisk.
Why?
I have no idea.
I think there was some things that Pat told me. Did he tell you about anything about, there was something about rabbits that he told me. I'd have to go back and listen to that episode, but there was some interesting, weird stuff about rabbits and the Bell Witch.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. There's a lot of rabbits can be creepy. They're also real sad because they bury their babies in my backyard, and then I find them later on and they accidentally die after I discover them. Hey guys, that's a story for another day.
Kara brings up the rocks too in the film, as far as taking stuff out of the cave. That's one of the things she mentions, that you should not do.
Yeah, you also shouldn't bring dolls home that are bought from the gift store at the Bell Caves,
Yeah.
Heather.
But you did, and I appreciate it greatly.
Why do they sell dolls at the Bell Witch Cave gift shop?
So Chris
That's-
Kirby, one of the owners of the cave, they have a little gift shop where it's a tiny cabin and a little gift area, and then you wait because they only take so many people in the cave at a time. Anyway, they have little things in there to sell, and Chris, a few years ago, started buying porcelain dolls, and in the off season, painting them to look creepy.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple years ago, I took my family down there, and my youngest, who at the time was 4, I think, picked out one of these dolls, brought her home. Her name's Sasha. That's what she named her. And she's proudly displayed in our kitchen. Well, when I couldn't go this year because of COVID, which was my plan to go back down to visit with the family, and that didn't happen. So when Seth got everything arranged to go down, I went ahead and called Kara and said, can you get me another doll? Because I would have gotten one had I been able to go. And she said, yeah, I'll send it home with Seth. And then I didn't tell Seth, I don't think, until he was already on the road, hey, when you see Kara, there's going to be a doll. I need you to bring it back to Ohio for me. And he loved it. It was great. She's a beautiful doll. Her name is Blair. Kara and I came up, the Blair Witch, get it?
Of course.
Yeah, and apparently Seth tried to break her, but thankfully Aaron fixed her. That's what
I
Aaron
would.
said.
I don't believe. First of all, never believe anything Aaron says. Second of all, she was like crushed in a car. I managed to at least keep her up near the front of the car so she didn't get crushed by all of our gear in the back. But she literally sat like on the floor right behind the driver's seat on most of that the time we got at home.
Well, she is porcelain, so it shouldn't take much.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I got her then when I came in for the interview. My interview was shot in the cabin here in Ohio, and Seth had her there for me then. And now she's here at home.
And nothing moves in your house? Like nothing happens?
But
With this series of creepy dolls that you have available?
Yeah. No, nothing yet. But there is a doll that was from the Bell Witch Cave that was sent to the Archive of the Afterlife, which was in Moundsville. It just got relocated to Cameron, West Virginia. My friend runs this museum that has a bunch of haunted artifacts, and someone who said she's a descendant of the Bells went to the cave a few years ago, bought a doll, had a bunch of horrible things happen, and she mailed the doll to him. And he let me see the letter, and in it she said that she was tired of the scratches. So that doll is in the Archive of the Afterlife museum. So yeah, and Kara also explained that somebody has sent one of those dolls back. I mean, they get rocks back at the cave all the time, but one of the dolls had been sent back, and then I guess Chris just put it right back on the shelf to be sold again. So I don't know which doll that was. Maybe the one that's in the archive, for all I know.
Wow. Creepy porcelain dolls. You got to send us a picture of you have like a whole collection of these things?
I have those two from the cave, and then I have a miniature Robert the doll.
Oh, no.
And a new one, her name is Lily, and my co-host actually found out about this one. I think that she's supposed to be like an alternative to Elf on the Shelf. That she's this little porcelain looking, she's not actually porcelain doll that's painted up all creepy. And my kids are sick of them. When a new doll arrives, they're like, we already have too many.
They just stare at you in the middle of the night.
Yeah. Well, when Robert showed up, 2 of my 3 kids started crying because they're familiar with Robert the doll. And they don't like Blair at all either.
Yeah, me either.
So they sell miniature Robert the dolls in the gift shop in Key West.
Yes, they do. Mm-hmm. And you can order them online. That's how I got mine, because I've never been to Key West.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are they like imbued with Robert's power? Do they take him and like rub them against Robert?
There's a note in there from Robert saying, take care of my mini-me. So
this is Bob. Well, Thank you guys so much for doing this. This has been excellent. I've really enjoyed this discussion. Seth, tell everybody where they can find the film and also your other films that I know you just came out like not too long ago, just a few months ago with the Mothman film and Trail UFOs, and just tell everybody where they can find all that.
Yeah. So at this point, most of our movies are available on most major streaming platforms, like iTunes and Google Play and YouTube and YouTube Movies, not free YouTube. Although there are some stuff there. We actually just posted like a director's cut of Beast of Whitehall free to YouTube. But yeah, most major streaming platforms. If you look up my name or Smalltown Monsters. But on Tuesday next week, The Mark of the Bell Witch will be available on Amazon Prime Video and Vimeo On Demand, or you can buy DVDs and Blu-rays at smalltownmonsters.com. And there will be, more than likely, there will be a wide release for Mark of the Bell Witch later in 2021. Not too much later. I would imagine by March you'll see it appearing on most major platforms. And then coming up, the Mothman Legacy as well is available on most major streaming platforms. And then coming up in 2021, we've got, I think, like between the Mark of the Bell Witch and this time next year, we're putting out like 6 new feature-length movies, but we're also going to have an episodic series on our Small Town Monster Squad, which is the name we gave to our YouTube channel membership. An episodic series called On the Trail of Hauntings, featuring one Heather Moser, where we're going around to different haunted locations. Right now, just in Ohio, but hopefully, if this is successful, we'll make it like an ongoing, and we'll be going other places. Nice. So we have a lot coming over the next couple of years.
Do you ever stop, Seth? Do you sleep?
No, I have a family to feed, and if I was home more, my wife would probably behead me.
Especially after you hung her from a tree.
Yeah, it's because of the tree incident, the hanging scene. She's got a lot to pay me back for.
Heather, where can people find you online, and also tell us about your podcast?
Yeah, so I'm a co-host for the podcast, the Caravan Library of Lore, with Lady Ann. And I do some stuff with Smalltown Monsters, research, and Seth already mentioned On the Trail of Hauntings, which will be coming out. We're wrapping that up here within the next month, actually. And I am a weird writer for Shannon LeGros' Into the Fray Weird Writer blog. I write the blog for the Caravan of Lore as well. And I don't know, I'm around different things. Help with the Writers Conference of Northern Appalachia, and I'm part of the Northern Appalachia Review, which is a journal for Northern Appalachian writers. And I do other stuff too, but it's just things here and there with all kinds of weird stuff.
And you, your day job is a classics history professor?
My day job is a professor of classics. Yep.
That is extremely fascinating. Okay, guys, thank you so much. Stay on the line for me. I'm going to close this out. And, guys, I'll be back on Conspirinormal. Okay, very nice little interview there with Seth Breedlove and Heather Moser. Missed Surfiel this week, but he's dealing with some things, and he will actually be back on the next episode because we already recorded the next episode. So that's weird how that works. So guys, just to close everything out, don't forget, you can, if you want to help support the show, if you really like what we're doing, you can go to patreon.com/conspirinormal, and you can, right now we have got a $1 membership that you can get a whole bunch of shows going back all the way to the end of 2016 that you guys have not heard. And also we are pretty much doing Patreons every week. And we recorded a Patreon where you guys, we talked, me and Serfiel and David Metcalf, we talked about the Joe Nickel article about the Masonic connection to the Bell Witch. So hope you guys will go check that out if you want to hear that. That is $1. However, that's going to be only for a limited amount of time, because around the 1st of January, we have got new tiers coming up. So stay tuned for that. All right, guys. Over and out. Don't forget, Conspirinormal Podcast on YouTube. Go give us a subscription. And guys, we will be back next week on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/conspirinormal, or leave a one-time donation at conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.